to all the countries all over the world via satellite. It's very difficult to comprehend. A live concert, to me, is exciting because of all the electricity that is generated in the crowd and on stage.
The government doesn't accidentally release things. Every document that gets declassified, every file that gets stamped and handed over to the public goes through layers of review, redaction, and deliberate decision-making. So when the FBI quietly released a file on Elvis Presley, one that had been sitting in a locked federal archive for decades, you have to ask yourself one question: why now? And more importantly, what exactly did they decide we were finally allowed to know? Because what's inside that file doesn't just complicate the Elvis story, it demolishes it. The file is real. It exists. It was obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and it carries the kind of bureaucratic language that makes your skin crawl precisely because it's so calm, so matter-of-fact, so utterly indifferent to the fact that it is describing the most famous entertainer in American history as a federal asset, not a fan, not a celebrity acquaintance, an asset, someone who was actively feeding information to the United States government while the whole world watched him shake his hips on national television and assumed he was the face of rebellion. Let that sit for a second. The man who parents feared, the man ministers preached against from their pulpits, the man who was filmed from the waist up on the Ed Sullivan Show because his movements were considered too dangerous for American living rooms, that man was, by multiple accounts within this file, working with the establishment he supposedly threatened, and not reluctantly, not under coercion, willingly, eagerly, with a level of enthusiasm that once you read the details, starts to rewrite everything you thought you understood about who Elvis Presley actually was. The FBI file on Elvis spans multiple pages, and while sections remain redacted to this day, blacked out with a kind of permanence that tells you the government still isn't ready to show all its cards, what has been released is staggering enough. The file references Elvis by name repeatedly, documents communications between federal agents regarding his usefulness, and outlines in careful clinical language the nature of his cooperation with law enforcement officials at the highest levels of the American government. This wasn't a casual relationship. This wasn't Elvis shaking hands with a sheriff at a charity event. This was structured, intentional, and it had been going on for years before anyone outside a small circle of federal agents had any idea. Now here's what makes this even more unsettling. The FBI didn't come to Elvis. Elvis went to them. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed. And that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The file references a moment that has been buried under decades of mythology and carefully managed public image. A moment where Elvis Presley, at the absolute height of his cultural power, made a private decision to align himself with the very forces of authority that his music had supposedly. And he didn't whisper about it. He didn't send a quiet message through a back channel. He walked up to the front door of power in this country in a way that left a paper trail so undeniable that 50 years later, federal archivists are still deciding how much of it the American public can handle. The timing of the declassification matters too. For years, researchers and historians who filed FOIA requests related to Elvis were met with delays, partial releases, and the bureaucratic equivalent of a door being quietly closed in their face. Full scope of what the FBI had on Elvis and what Elvis had given the FBI remained frustratingly out of reach until it wasn't. Until, piece by piece, page by page, the picture started to emerge. And the picture looks nothing like the velvet paintings, nothing like the jumpsuits and the gospel records and the Hollywood smile. The picture looks like a man living two lives simultaneously. One life for the cameras, one life for the government. And the terrifying thing, The detail that should make every Elvis fan stop and reconsider everything is how good he was at keeping them separate. Because here's the question that the FBI file raises and refuses to answer cleanly. If Elvis was working with federal agents, if he was feeding them information, if he had inserted himself into the machinery of American law enforcement with this level of commitment and this level of secrecy, then who exactly was he reporting on? Who in his world, in the music industry, in the orbit of celebrity and fame that surrounded him every single day, had no idea that the king of rock and roll was watching them? And more chillingly, did any of them ever find out? That answer is in section 2. And once you hear it, the Elvis you grew up loving will never look quite the same again. It's December 21st, 1970. The Vietnam War is tearing the country apart. Anti-war protests are erupting on college campuses. The counterculture movement is at its absolute peak, and America is a nation divided so deeply that people are questioning the very foundations of their government. And on this particular morning, a man walks through the northwest gate of the White House without an appointment. No scheduled meeting, no press briefing, no official invitation, just a handwritten letter tucked under his arm and an absolute certainty that the President of the United States would want to see him. That man was Elvis Presley. And what happened inside that meeting didn't just shock the aides and security personnel who witnessed it. It revealed something about Elvis that the public wouldn't fully understand for another 50 years. Because Elvis didn't walk into the White House as a fan seeking a photo opportunity. He didn't go there to perform or to charm or to do what celebrities typically do when they brush up against political power. He went there with a proposal. A serious, thought-out, deeply personal proposal that would have seemed completely insane coming from almost anyone else. But somehow, coming from Elvis, it worked. He wanted to be a federal agent. The people closest to Elvis, the Memphis Mafia, as the press had taken to calling the tight circle of friends and employees who surrounded him, noticed changes they couldn't explain. Elvis had always been intense, always been controlling, but something shifted after the Nixon meeting. He became more watchful, more guarded about certain conversations. He started asking questions that didn't fit the context, probing people in his circle about their political beliefs, their associations, their opinions on figures and movements that had nothing to do with the music business. At the time, those around him chalked it up to eccentricity, to the isolation of fame, to the pharmaceutical fog that was already beginning to cloud his later years. But looking back through the lens of the declassified FBI file, a very different explanation starts to take shape. Elvis wasn't just curious, he was cataloging. He had cultivated, over years of observation and carefully maintained relationships, an almost encyclopedic knowledge of who was connected to whom in the entertainment world, who was funding what, who was saying what behind closed doors, who in Hollywood and Nashville and the broader cultural landscape held views or associations that a federal agency might find very, very interesting. And he was sharing that knowledge, systematically, in a way that his friends never saw coming, because they were too busy watching the performance to notice the surveillance happening right beside them. And here's the layer of irony. The rebellious, dangerous, anti-establishment outsider was the exact image that gave him access to the people he was allegedly reporting on. Nobody suspected the king. Nobody imagined that the man who had scandalized a generation, who had been called a corrupting influence on American youth, who had been watched with suspicion by the very institutions he was now secretly serving, nobody imagined he was one of them. That invisibility wasn't accidental. It was the most powerful tool he had. But here is where the story takes a turn that even the most devoted Elvis historians weren't prepared for. Because the FBI file doesn't just show us an Elvis who approached the government. It reveals something far more unsettling. The government had been building a file on Elvis long before he ever walked through that White House gate. long before he wrote that letter to Nixon. Long before he asked for a badge, they were already watching him. Which means the real question isn't why Elvis went to the FBI. The real question is what the FBI already knew about Elvis that made them so willing to say yes when he finally came knocking. And the answer to that question lives in a part of the file that most people have never heard discussed. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. A version where Elvis Presley, overcome with patriotism and a genuine love for his country, walked into the arms of the federal government as a naive, well-meaning celebrity who simply wanted to do his part. A version where the badge was a trophy, the Nixon meeting was a quirky historical footnote, and the FBI file was nothing more than routine surveillance of a famous person in a paranoid era. That version is comfortable. That version lets you keep the Elvis you grew up with intact. But the declassified file doesn't give you that version. The FBI's interest during this period was laser-focused on what J. Edgar Hoover had identified as the most dangerous forces in American society. And Hoover's definition of dangerous was breathtakingly broad. Anti-war activists, civil rights organizers, musicians and artists whose influence over young Americans Hoover believed was being weaponized against the state. Hoover didn't just want to monitor these people. He wanted to map their networks, understand their funding, identify who was coordinating with whom, and ultimately dismantle movements he considered existential threats to the American way of life. To do that effectively, he needed people inside those worlds. Elvis was a perfect instrument for exactly that purpose. The file references intelligence related to individuals within the entertainment industry who were connected to leftist political organizations, anti-government movements, and figures that federal agencies had already placed under active investigation. Without naming every name that appears in the partially redacted pages, what becomes undeniably clear is that Elvis was providing more than casual observations. He was identifying people, flagging association, reporting conversations that took place in private settings where no official government presence would ever have been permitted. Settings where people spoke freely because they trusted the man sitting across from them, because that man was Elvis, because nobody suspected the king. And this is where the moral weight of the story becomes genuinely suffocating. Because these weren't nameless bureaucrats or faceless radicals. These were people in Elvis's life. People who had shared meals with him, traveled with him, sat in his home, and believed they were in the presence of a friend. Some of them were fellow musicians. Some were activists whose only crime was believing that the war in Vietnam was wrong and saying so loudly. Some were people whose politics Elvis may have personally disagreed with, but who had never done anything that most reasonable people would consider a threat to national security. And yet their names, their associations, their private words ended up in a federal file because Elvis put them there. Now here is the question that the file forces you to sit with, and it is not a comfortable one. Was Elvis a man who genuinely believed he was protecting his country? Or was he a man so desperate for the approval of authority, so psychologically tangled in his need to be seen as powerful and legitimate by the institutions that had always made him feel like an outsider, that he convinced himself the surveillance was righteous when it was really just obedience, dressed up as patriotism? Because those are two very different things. And the distinction matters enormously when you consider what was done with the information he provided. The FBI during this era didn't just file reports and move on. Under COINTELPRO, the Bureau's now infamous covert program designed to surveil, infiltrate, and destroy political organizations it deemed subversive, intelligence gathered from informants was used to derail careers, fracture relationships, trigger arrests, and in some documented cases, contribute to outcomes far more devastating than anyone involved ever publicly admitted. And then Elvis died, suddenly, at 42, in circumstances that have never been fully explained to the satisfaction of the people who knew him best. And within a very short time after his death, certain files were quietly sealed. Certain connections between Elvis Presley and the machinery of American federal power were buried under the mythology of the king The file proves it happened, and the question of what exactly died with Elvis in that Graceland bathroom is one the government has been carefully, deliberately, and persistently refusing to answer ever since. There is something deeply unsettling about the way Elvis Presley's death was handled, not just medically, not just by the people in that Graceland bathroom who made decisions in those first horrifying minutes that have been questioned ever since, but institutionally, governmentally, because in the weeks and months that followed August 16, 1977, something happened that had nothing to do with grief or mourning or the global outpouring of devastation from fans who had lost their king. Something quiet happened in the background, something deliberate. Files were sealed, communications were closed off, and the specific threads connecting Elvis Presley to the federal apparatus he had spent years quietly serving were tucked away with a speed and efficiency that, in retrospect, looks less like bureaucratic routine and a great deal more like damage control. Ask yourself why that would be necessary. If Elvis's relationship with the FBI was as innocent as a celebrity playing dress-up with a federal badge, there would be nothing to protect after his death. Eccentric, yes. Unusual, certainly. But not something that required the kind of institutional silence that descended around certain aspects of his file in the years following 1977. The speed of that silence is itself a form of evidence, because governments don't rush to bury things that don't matter. They only move that fast when something does. The Memphis Mafia, the men who had lived inside Elvis's world for years, who had traveled with him, protected him, watched him from closer than almost anyone, have spoken in interviews over the decades about a version of Elvis that the public never fully saw. A man who was deeply, almost pathologically conflicted, who loved America with an intensity that bordered on devotion, but who also carried a private shame that none of them could ever quite identify the source of. A man who in his final years had become withdrawn in ways that went beyond the physical deterioration everyone could see, who sometimes went quiet in the middle of conversations for no apparent reason, who kept things locked, literally and figuratively, that he never explained to the people closest to him. Looking back now, through the lens of what the declassified file reveals, that silence reads differently, that withdrawal reads differently. Because if Elvis had spent years feeding information about people in his life to federal agencies, if he had watched friendships and careers and livelihoods pass through his hands and into a government pipeline he couldn't fully control or even fully understand, the psychological weight of that would have been extraordinary. Elvis was not a cold man. Every account of him, even the most critical, acknowledges that he was emotionally porous, deeply sensitive, capable of profound warmth and crippling guilt in equal measure. A man like that does not play informant without paying a price for it somewhere deep inside. And by the mid-1970s, the price was written all over him. But here is what the declassified file ultimately forces us to confront. And it is perhaps the most important question this entire story raises. Does knowing this change who Elvis was? Does the revelation that the king of rock and roll operated in the shadows of American federal power, that he reported on people he knew, that he inserted himself into a surveillance apparatus that caused real harm to real lives, does that erase the music? Does it cancel the art? Does it make the voice less extraordinary, the performances less electric, the cultural earthquake he triggered any less seismic? The honest answer is complicated. Because Elvis Presley existed in multiple truths simultaneously. He was a genuinely revolutionary artist who changed the sound and the soul of American music in ways that are still reverberating today. And he was also, apparently, a man who made choices in private that contradict the rebellious image that art projected. Both of those things are true. And sitting with the discomfort of both of those things being true at the same time is not a failure of loyalty to Elvis. It is the only intellectually honest response to what the file shows us. What makes it even more haunting is what we still don't know. Because the declassified version of the FBI file is not complete. There are pages that remain redacted. The government released enough to confirm the relationship existed. It has not released enough to fully define what that relationship cost. And until those remaining redactions are lifted, if they ever are, the full truth of what Elvis Presley did, what he knew, what he was asked to do, and what was ultimately done with everything he provided will remain exactly where the government placed it. In the dark, alongside the king himself, Elvis Aaron Presley was buried at Graceland, on the grounds of the home he loved, in a grave that millions of people visit every year to lay flowers and feel something they can't entirely articulate. They go there to be near something that mattered, something that changed them. And that is real, and that is valid, and no declassified file can touch it. But somewhere above that grave, in a federal building in Washington, there are still pages with his name on them that nobody outside a small circle of government officials has ever been allowed to read. And whatever is written on those pages, whatever secrets the king carried into that Graceland bathroom and never carried out, the government has decided, even now, that you are not ready to know. Maybe they're right. Or maybe the truth about Elvis was always too big, too messy, and too deeply human to fit inside the myth they needed him to be. If this story shook you the way it shook me, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about Elvis because they don't. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay close, because the next story we're telling is just as explosive, just as buried, and just as real.